Welcome to the session on implementing disruptive technology successfully. My name is Matt Dillon, and I will be the presenter. A little bit about me before moving on. I am based in San Antonio, Texas, where I went to school at the University of Texas at San Antonio, got a degree in 1984. I spent some time practicing architecture, both as an intern and as a licensed architect, and in that time also began working with computer-aided drafting, and back in those days, it was primarily AutoCAD and related products. But I've been in the Autodesk channel in some capacity for 35 years now. I've spoken out at Autodesk University for several years, hold the normal certifications and accreditations that one would expect for someone in my position. So our agenda today, we're going to talk about exactly what is disruptive technology and what does that mean, and then talk about the things that we frequently see with BIM implementations that cause them to fail if they fail, and what can cause that. We'll also then talk about best practices for implementing BIM technologies. And again, when I refer to BIM technologies, my focus has always been on Revit, but you can extrapolate this out to really any kind of disruptive technology that you may be implementing. So if you're a civil engineer and you're implementing, say, InfraWorks or Civil 3D, or you're a plant designer and you're implementing Plant 3D or something like that, the same things apply, right? It doesn't really matter what the technology is. The way you go about implementing it at a high level is pretty much the same. And so we're going to talk about some of those best practices, some of those things that can avoid those pitfalls, right? Then we'll talk about something I call a culture of continuous improvement. And then we'll look at some case studies from past people that I've worked with here at Applied Software and GRAITEC, and how those went about either succeeding or failing. And these are all success stories. So we'll talk about how those work. They're all slightly different firms, slightly different situations. So you'll get a good breadth of coverage. Then we'll finally finish it off with some question and answer. So first off, what is disruptive technology? You know, if you look at the phone there on the right, it's not really a phone, right? It's really a computer that just happens to have a phone inside it. If you think about where we were, say, just 20 years ago or less, you know, I can remember I had a flip phone for sure. I can remember the days when we didn't even have cellular phones. But go back 20 years, I had a flip phone, and it was a phone. That's pretty much all it did. And yeah, I could send text messages, and that was about it. But now I've got, just like just about everybody else, I've got a smartphone, and I do quite a few things on it. I don't think I've been in my bank physically for years. I do all of my banking online. I can make airline reservations online, hotel reservations online. I can do a lot of my office tasks online. A lot of our office applications have an app on the phone. So this is definitely something that's disrupted our lives, right? It's not a negative thing, and you know that's the thing. You know, disruptive technology frequently gets a bad rap. You know, it's almost seen as synonymous with bad. Well, it's not. It's a big change. It's a shift. You know, if you think about when we first went from paper drafting to CAD, and I was there, I was part of that. I started out after school drafting on vellum and mylar, and then in a few years we started transitioning to CAD. That was not a disruptive shift. We just had to learn a new tool. We had to learn how to use a computer, and we had to learn how to draft on a computer. But the drafting itself, the process of drafting and the process of getting a project delivered and what those deliverables might be really didn't change. We were still plotting them out on paper, and the end result was pretty much the same as what we did by doing it by hand, other than maybe my lettering was a little bit better. But then we started seeing the shift from CAD to BIM, and that is a disruptive change. And anybody that's gone that route will tell you that. It involves quite a bit more than just learning how to use a new tool. It's changing the way you think about your data and your projects. Data does become much more important than it was in the old days. And then the way you deliver a project is different as well. So much more disruptive than, say, the old paper to CAD transition. Other examples of disruptive technology that pretty much everybody's familiar with, again, the smartphone, of course, but also think back to the printing press. The printing press was a revolutionary event and a revolutionary invention, and it was very disruptive. Now you didn't have just the kind of literally the high priesthood that knew how to read and write. That expanded knowledge out to the masses. Um, Automobiles, right? So for better or for worse, automobiles change the way we live. Here in the United States, the transition has been fairly dramatic from the old horse pull buggy to cars, and now we have a society that pretty much revolves around cars, again, for better or for worse. Personal computers, again, when I first got out of school and entered the workforce, very few people had a computer in their house. We had maybe a couple at work, but in a very short amount of time, computers became ubiquitous on almost every household, or at least in most middle class and upper class households. Some people have multiple computers in their houses. So when we talk about disruptive technology, we also are talking about something called the technology adoption curve. And this is not just for BIM technologies. This is for any kind of new disruptive technology and what its life cycle might look like, its adoption life cycle. Initially, the only people that are really taking a look at it and using it to some extent are what we call the innovators. And these are people that don't usually have a whole lot of money, but they're very interested in technology and cool gadgets and things like that. And so if you think again about Revit, this would have been around the late 1990s when Revit was first coming out, and it was a competitor for what was then Autodesk's flagship architectural product, Architectural Desktop. But there weren't that many people using it, very few, but they were very excited about it. And that drove it into the next stage, which is the early adopters, where you have a few more people that are now starting to take notice and start to dabble with it. And this is where technology either makes it or breaks it. It has to get past the early adopters. This is also what we call the chasm. In order to be successful, it has to be picked up by the early majority. And this is where some of the pragmatists start to look at it and start to see it as something that might be a viable tool. And then we have the late majority where, pretty much it's a given now that this is the way technology is going. Might as well get on board. And then finally, we have the laggards. Now, laggard seems like a little bit of a derogatory term. I think probably could come up with something a little bit better. But basically, what this part of the curve represents is when most of the market has already adopted the technology, there's always a few people, some holdouts that adopt it at the end. Where you are on this curve, or where say Revit, for example, if we're going to talk about Revit, where Revit is on this curve really depends on the discipline. For architects, I would argue that we're pretty much at the laggard phase. Most architects have adopted Revit. So the people that are adopting now have, for whatever reason, good or bad, have resisted adopting, but for whatever reason are now having to adopt Revit. If you are an MEP engineer, I would say we're getting into the late majority, right? Most MEP engineers that I deal with have adopted Revit to some extent. And so I'd say we're probably going into the late majority for them. Structural engineers, maybe the early majority. We get into other disciplines that are not the traditional, architectural MEP, interior design, things like lighting designers and kitchen designers and things like that. Those people are now starting to get into Revit, and I would say that we're probably in the early adoption phase for some of those disciplines. So it depends on the product, depends on the discipline as to where you are. Regardless of where you are and when you decide to jump on the bandwagon and implement BIM or any, again, disruptive technology, the pitfalls are going to be pretty much the same. Some will become more important than others depending on where you are on the technology curve, but they'll all be there. The first one, and this is really important, is lack of ownership and buy-in from leadership. And the reason why this is so important is if you don't have top-down mandated, if you don't have a top-down mandated effort to implement BIM, it's probably going to fail. This is not something that can percolate up from the grassroots. It's got to have it's not got to be just tolerated by management, but it's got to be mandated and supported fully by management. No plan. Yeah, we're just going to buy some software, maybe get some training, and we're going to go, right? You could have gotten away with that back in the CAD to or the paper to CAD transition, but the CAD to BIM transition, you must have a plan. Without a plan, it's going to fail, guaranteed. No commitment. Again, there's going to be some rough spots. There's no way to get around it. If you're not committed, then it's going to be too easy to fall back on older technologies. The implementation will fail. And I've seen this over and over again where firms will get to a certain point with their implementation, they hit a roadblock, and rather than power through, they back up and go back to the old technology. And I've seen cases where some firms have tried to implement multiple times and they get to that roadblock and they drop back because they're afraid they're going to lose money on the current project or whatever, right? You have to power through. You have to be committed. You've got to get out of the mindset that it's just a replacement for CAD. It isn't. If it was just a replacement for CAD, then it'd be as simple as buying the software and getting some training. That's all you'd have to do, right? But again, this is a fundamental shift in the way you work. It's going to affect your office all the way through, not just the people that are using the tool, but everybody involved in project delivery is going to be affected by this tool. So you can't think of it as just a replacement for CAD. It's a fundamental change. No accountability. People have to be accountable for their part in the process. Too busy. This is a very, very common reason I hear for people that are trying to implement, and it usually comes up when we're talking about training. Too busy to get training. I can't have my people offline for so much time before they can be productive. And I would argue that if you take the time to get your people properly trained, in the end, they're going to be much more productive than had they not. Right. So too busy. Yeah, we're always busy, but you've got to find the time. It's imperative. And then again, if you're in that quote unquote laggard stage, it may be that you're being forced to adopt BIM. And when that happens, sometimes it's a half-baked effort, right? It's not something that you're really committed to. It's not something maybe you even want to do for that matter, but you have to because of market pressures, whatever, right? You need to find a way of dealing with that and changing the mindset, because if you go into it with a mindset or frankly with a chip on your shoulder, it's probably not going to be a very well done implementation. So what can we do instead? What are some elements for success? You'll see that some of these are kind of the reverse of what we just saw, right? So choose to adopt BIM. Again, if you're being forced to adopt BIM, then think of it as an opportunity, right? So, well, if we've got to do this, let's do it right. Try to make the best of it. As they say, if life hands you lemons, make lemonade, right? So flip the script, right? Don't let this give you a bad taste in your mouth, but really embrace it. Make it a success if you got to do it anyway. Again, make sure this is driven by leadership. This has got to come from the top down. Leadership must have buy-in. They must be committed, and it has to come from them, right? They have to provide the tools. They have to provide the time. They have to give their people the confidence to know that, hey, you can fail. That's part of the process. Don't be afraid to fail. Yes, we know this is going to take time. We know you're not going to be that productive at first while you're learning. You have to have that leadership commitment and buy-in and support. This is also important. A lot of times when firms go this route, they don't really have anybody on staff that knows much about it. Some firms will go out and try to hire somebody that knows something about it, but what usually happens there is you'll have one person that comes in, may or may not know as much as they need to know. It's hard to tell if someone knows what they need to know to help you implement BIM if you don't know what they need to know, right? So you don't know what you don't know. So sometimes hiring someone to drive your BIM implementation can work. Sometimes it's not so successful because that person may, again, not know enough, or they might wind up getting sucked into production work, and now they too don't have the time to properly implement BIM. So find a third-party resource. Find somebody that knows what they're doing, that can help you. Yes, it may cost you some money. Obviously, we do that at service here, and we don't do it for free, but it works. We can be an objective third party to help you get your BIM implementation going, to serve as an advisor, to tell you, oh, what are some of the things that you can do with BIM, help you determine what your goals are, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, and then how to get there and how to keep you from biting off more than you can chew. Sometimes people go into BIM with these with an idea that they're just going to get massive results, massive benefits from it right away in a variety of different areas. Well, yeah, ultimately you will, but it's best if you focus on a few areas at first. Just don't try to boil the ocean, take it in bite-sized pieces. And again, we're going to talk about that as well with the continuous improvement, culture of continuous improvement. But that third-party resource can help you identify those meaningful benefits that you can get without having to bite off more than you can chew. Reward performance and growth, and this could be monetary, right? If someone excels at it, then maybe they get a raise, or maybe they become a BIM manager if that's what they want to do, or maybe you just recognize them with time off or promotion, or just verbal, attaboys, kudos, right? But reward that performance and growth when people start to learn these new tools and succeed. Provide support, and again, this goes along with that trusted, knowledgeable resource. Give your team an avenue for support, a lifeline. So when they run into trouble on a project and they need help, they've got someone that they can reach out to and mentor them through the process. Or if they need a new piece of content and they don't know how to create it, there's an avenue to go and get that content created or to show them how to do it. And then, of course, develop a plan. And again, that's what that third-party resource can help you do, is to develop a reasonable plan, but also be ready for those course corrections, because it's inevitable, right? You always need a plan, but also expect that plan to change as things start to develop. Don't bail, be patient. You're going to hit rough spots, guaranteed. You're going to hit spots in the course of your implementation where you run up against a wall and people are getting frustrated. This is actually your opportunity. Power through it, because when you do that, that is a huge learning opportunity, and you'll be more successful at the end. If you bail, you're going right back to square one, and you didn't really get anywhere. All your efforts are wasted up to this point. So if you're a larger firm, the planning part might look a little bit more involved than, say, a smaller firm. And a high-level implementation roadmap for an organization like that might look something like this. And again, this is very kind of basic or very kind of, again, it's high level. The first stage is discovery. And at this point, we haven't identified any tools, any software. Again, I've been talking primarily with Revit in mind, but again, this can apply to anything, not even just BIM, right? So, but let's say you're thinking about implementing BIM. Well, believe it or not, there are more tools to use for BIM than just Revit. Even if you're an architect and you're authoring the model, there's other tools besides Revit. I won't mention them, but there are others. So the first step is to identify which tool is best for us. Where are we? How ready are we to adopt that tool? And based on that, what do we want to try to what kind of benefits do we want to gain from that tool? And then, armed with that information, with desired level of implementation, you're going to establish your goals and objectives first. Make sure you've got a valid use case for each of those goals. And then, what is that going to mean for your implementation? At what level do you have to take it? But again, this is a very important stage, is identifying meaningful, realistic, and attainable goals. And then strategic planning. Okay, now that we know what the goals are, now that we know what we want to accomplish, this is where we can start to identify the tools that we need, what features of those tools do we want to use, and then how are we going to prepare ourselves to use them. That's the strategic planning. And then the implementation planning. This gets down into the nuts and bolts. This is where you might develop some process maps for various things. You might determine your information requirements and your technology requirements. Maybe you need some hardware upgrades. Maybe you need some network upgrades. Maybe your internet speeds are too slow to do what you want to do. You might need to improve that, right? So there's a lot of non-process and non-software related things that might be involved here. Also an infrastructure plan. And then, of course, education and training. And then your roadmap, determine your important milestones. So where are we going to be, say, in a year? Where do we want to be in 2 years, et cetera? And then estimate how much time do you think it's going to take out of your billable work, right? And then what information do you need to make it happen? Again, this is a very high level implementation roadmap. It's not necessary for everybody, but if you're a larger firm and you're still not sure what tools you're going to be using, what the processes are going to be, this might be a good exercise to go through at some level. But if you've already determined, for example, that you're going to implement Revit, right? Well, then this is more what it might look like. You've already identified the tool. You've identified the things that you want to accomplish with your initial implementation. How do you go about doing that? Again, the first step is a discovery. And the discovery, in this case, usually involves looking at your current deliverables. What is it that you still need in your deliverables? Again, establishing those realistic goals, and then document any kind of supporting standards and content. And an example of that is, looking at the deliverables, we can determine, for example, what kind of title blocks do you need? What kind of annotation symbology do you need? What are your line weights and your line styles, your text types, your dimension types? All of that mundane stuff, as well as things that you may not normally think about if you're coming from, say, an AutoCAD environment and moving to Revit. Things like view settings and view templates and pre-configured views, lots of stuff around views when you implement Revit. All of that stuff should be documented somewhere. We'll talk more about that in a minute. That's extremely important, and that's where a lot of people miss the boat. They just go ahead and they develop their project template, which is where most of those standards are stored, and it's a critical part of any implementation, but they don't document it, and that can cause problems down the road. So then once you've done that, you go ahead and develop that template. And again, the template, if we're talking Revit, really involves not just graphic standards that are built in, but annotation symbology and a ton of application settings. For example, if you're an MEP engineer, there are literally hundreds of settings that are probably standardized or can be standardized. They'll probably be the same on virtually every project you work on. Those should be in your template, so you're not constantly having to reset things every time you start a new project. So the template is an extremely important part of the implementation. I know people that have used AutoCAD for years without a really defined AutoCAD DWT file template, right? They just use it with the default settings, or they'll bring up a drawing that they did a year ago and save it as a new drawing and start from there, right? You can't do that with technology like Revit. You've got to have a template to start with, and that template really needs to store all of your firm's custom standards and content. And of course, training. Training is important. Typically, of course, we'll provide fundamentals training once the template is done. But then we always like to recommend at some point, maybe down the road, it may not be a good idea to do it right away, but to consider some more intermediate and advanced training. It may be something that you only have for certain people, right? After you've gone a few months and there's been a few people that you've identified that are really, really good at this and learning fast and want to embrace it and want to do well at it and want to excel at it, then maybe for those people you offer some intermediate or some advanced training, and they become kind of your power users, what I call the BIM priesthood. And then finally, mentoring, and this is what I like to refer to as just-in-time learning. And this is where you get over those rough spots. You don't just consider the thing done after you've got a template and you've had people up with fundamentals training. Frankly, you're just getting started. And the first project or two these people work on, they're going to struggle. They're going to run into things that either weren't covered in the class, maybe too advanced, there wasn't time, something like that, or they may just run into things that they've forgotten. It isn't 100% retention on training ever, right? So that's what the mentoring is meant to address, is when you run into those roadblocks, you have someone that you can reach out to that can literally look over your shoulder and walk you through the process. That's when you really, really learn. That's when the education really takes place. And it's also a good way to review training concepts as well. But you're not done. And this is where I like to talk about the culture of continuous improvement. Yes, you may be done with your initial implementation. You're now at a point where you're getting projects out, you're being productive, you're getting some of those first few benefits that you wanted to get. And typical things are better coordinated drawing sets, less RFIs and rework, maybe able to hire more young people out of college that are interested in working for a firm that is using BIM technology. Those are some fairly common initial goals. But then start thinking of others, like, well, maybe now we start looking at how we can use this building information model for estimating, or for sustainable energy analysis, or for um, rendering, visualization, et cetera. I mean, the list is endless, the things that you can do. Identify a few more goals, right? And then you start your implementation over. The good news is, after the first push, that's really where the heavy lifting occurs. The rest of this can be fairly lightweight as far as the effort required. But the way it works is, again, your initial implementation, the template standards development, the BIM execution plan, technology upgrades, your skills development. You finish all of this, the pilot project, mentoring, then do a postmortem. So after the first couple of projects, then come back and do a postmortem. Okay, what is working well? What is maybe not working so well that we can improve? And is there anything that we aren't taking advantage of now that would give us additional benefits down the road if we started to implement that? And then you start the process over. It may involve some changes to your template and your documentation. It may involve some more training. It may involve some mentoring. Again, you'll probably find that it's not nearly as extensive as your initial implementation, but it'll have some of the same elements. This is something that you should do on a regular basis. I would strongly suggest that you do it on a quarterly or a biannual basis, where you sit down and you just analyze what's working well, what's not working so well, how can we fix it, and where can we push our technology a little bit further to get better benefit, even more benefits than we're currently getting. Documentation, very important, and it's easy to do. And I'm not talking about a BIM standards manual. Frankly, I find those to be of little use. Back in my early days, I was a CAD manager, and I very diligently developed about a 1/4 inch to a 3/8 inch thick CAD standards manual. Had all of our layer standards in there, text standards, dimensioning, the whole works. And people basically used it to level their desks. Nobody reads that stuff, right? So that's not really what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is documenting, for example, in this case, what's in your template. What do your standards consist of? And it's not really meant for the use by the average user. It's meant for someone else who might be coming along a few years later to make changes to your template and your implementation due to that culture of continuous improvement. And they may not have been around when the template was initially developed. This will give them some idea of what's in there, and maybe some ideas of where it came about and why it came about, right? So this is an example of something we've done in the past, where it's just a simple Excel spreadsheet divided up into multiple worksheets for different types of content, different types of standards, and it identifies what's in the template and what it's made of. Easy to do. You do it as you're developing the template. As you make changes, you modify this document. It doesn't take very long at all. It's just something you have to be intentional about and take the time to do. Trust me, it'll save you a lot of trouble in the end. So let's talk about some firms that we've helped in the past and how that went. And I've left some of the firm names out, and I did get permission from these firms to use them as a case study, but one or two asked that we not mention who they were. So I thought, in fairness, we would just keep them all anonymous. If anybody's interested in who these were, I'll be happy to share it with you, provided it's one of the firms that gave us permission. First is a small architectural firm. They're based in Amarillo, Texas, and they reached out to us, or one of their partners reached out to us. This firm had no prior exposure. They had not done anything BIM related at all in the past. Still using AutoCAD. I think they're using Architectural Desktop or AutoCAD Architecture, but really using it as a 2D tool for the most part. Not really a heavy implementation at all. They really didn't have any pressure to implement. There was nobody asking them for BIM deliverables. None of their consultants were using BIM. They could have continued on for a while using the same tools they were using, but this particular principal understood that ultimately they were going to see pressures to implement, and he was trying to basically get ahead of that curve. So their initial goals were pretty simple. They just wanted to bring their current staff up to proficiency with Revit, and begin doing any new projects with Revit. Beyond that, they really didn't have any expectations or goals. Keep the same status quo deliverables. We're really not looking for anything else. Just want to be able to do it in Revit so that when people ask us, can you do it in Revit, we can answer yes, right? So again, a couple of keys to their potential success. Forward-thinking leadership. Again, this goes back to that leadership mandate, right? Forward-thinking leadership anticipated that at some point they were going to have to do this. They might as well do it now, right? They also recognized that they didn't have anybody on staff that knew nearly enough to make this happen, and so they reached out to us for help. So the approach we took, we did minimal discovery. We pretty much just looked at their deliverables and identified those things that needed to be in the template to make their new deliverables as consistent as possible with the old. Sometimes that's not a requirement. Most firms like some consistency. And then we developed a custom template and standards that were developed from those that data that we analyzed during the discovery. We did fundamentals for the end users, and then we did some advanced BIM manager training for just a couple of 3 people in their firm, not very many people at all, but just more training on how to maintain the template moving forward, how to create custom content, that kind of thing. And then we had they did a pilot project, and we mentored them through that pilot project. Fairly cut and dried implementation. Again, small firm. Smaller the firm, the easier the implementation. Okay, so after the first year, they by then had 7 projects completed and through construction, or at least currently under construction, that they had done in Revit. They had 7 other projects that were currently in progress. They realized additional benefits that they hadn't even thought of initially, which is not really a surprise. They started getting involved with clash detection, 3D clash detection, and wound up with reduced change orders. They had better communication between themselves and the owners because they were able to properly convey to the owner what the building was going to look like. Owners frequently don't have a good feel for a good sense of things by looking at 2D drawings, but they were able to easily communicate 3D design intent with the owner. And if there were changes, they were able to easily react and quickly react to those changes. Okay. They also determined that or found that the BIM process encouraged a 3D thought process among their teams. And this is something that I've always mentioned whenever I teach a Revit fundamentals class, is that there are some aspects of this that cannot be taught, and that is thinking in 3D. As architects and engineers, we are taught to work in 2D, think in 3D, or work in 3D, think in 2D, or represent in 2D. But now with Revit, you're actually simulating, not just modeling, but simulating a building, and it changes the way you think. You have to think about it differently. Not something that can be taught. And it's usually what we refer to as getting it when someone catches on, right? And they also noticed that they were able to get earlier 3D feedback much earlier in the process. I've heard people complain that when you go to a BIM process that you have to decide too much too soon, which is really not true. We could talk about that for days, but it's really not true. But what it did give them was a lot more knowledge about their project earlier on in the process, just by the virtue of being in 3D. Okay, another firm. This is a mid-sized firm in Fort Worth, and this firm had been using Revit, had a successful implementation to some extent for several years, but it kind of stagnated. It hadn't really progressed any. And as it turns out, there were only a few people. There was a core group of Revit power users, and only their projects were the ones that were using Revit. And they were very successful, but the rest of the office was still on AutoCAD. They were very intimidated at it and really didn't want any part of switching to Revit. They didn't have a dedicated BIM manager. I think that was part of the problem. But here's the big one. They had existing standards, and this is what I talked about earlier. The template had not been modified or updated in 5 to 6 years, and the reason for that is the original person that developed the template was no longer with the firm. People move around, right? And they never documented what was in there, so everybody was afraid to touch the template because they didn't know what was important and what wasn't. They were afraid to break anything. So documentation is really important. So the approach we took here was we did several discovery meetings. We talked to the beginner and the novice users, the ones that weren't using Revit at all. Okay, what was their concerns, and what would they like to get out of Revit if they were to use it? right? And then we talked to the intermediate users, and you can see that they had a different set of standards. Some of the project managers actually had kind of gone rogue and developed their own template. Again, no documentation. Then we had advanced users. They really wanted to get into some super advanced stuff, and they wanted that kind of training. And then we had a group of interior designers who really didn't see Revit. They really weren't intimidated by it, but they didn't see Revit as something that was well suited for interior design. So the approach we took, three immediate goals. We needed to update their existing template with new and revised standards, and hopefully bring those kind of rogue template elements into play where they made sense, right? So that we get a little bit more buy-in from everybody. Also transition the entire architectural department, including the people that were scared of Revit, didn't want to go to Revit. We needed to transition everybody to Revit. And then also do the same for the interior designers and get them using Revit as well, which was going to take a little bit more work to get some content to support their work. Then we did some training, and we did really two groups. We did the architects, both the beginner and the intermediate users, and then we did training for the interior designers, different workflow. We did not address the desire for the advanced users to do more advanced training, but that is always something that can be done at any time. But part of the implementation was to get those people that weren't using Revit or not using it effectively using Revit, and again, get their standards updated. And then, of course, we provided ongoing remote mentoring on demand. So the results, again, about a year later, we checked in with them. The people that were previously hesitant were fine. They were embracing BIM technologies. They liked doing it. They did not want to go back to AutoCAD. Yes, they had some projects that were still in AutoCAD, but those were legacy projects that it just didn't make sense to bring them forward into Revit. Everything else is being done in Revit. And people that were working on the AutoCAD projects really didn't want to work on them anymore. They wanted to work on the Revit projects. The interior design department unanimously embraced Revit once we got them through the training and got them the content that they needed. Okay. And what we found, and this is common, if you take somebody that's against something and you show them that it's not so bad after all, and maybe it's a good thing, they can become your biggest champion. And that's what happened here. The people that were the most resistive wound up being the biggest champions for Revit. Still no dedicated BIM manager, which could be a problem moving forward. But ultimately, I would call this implementation a success. Okay, now we have a multidisciplinary firm. So this is a firm in Nebraska, headquartered in Nebraska. They do civil engineering, they do structural engineering, they do electrical engineering, and they also do architecture. They had a small architectural group. And this architectural group, we're actually seeing that they were losing some business because they were not able to provide a BIM deliverable, but they were still somewhat resistant, right? It was change, and they were somewhat resistant to that. But they also admitted that they were having difficulty getting new talent because people coming out of school didn't know AutoCAD, didn't want to know AutoCAD, and already knew Revit and wanted to work for a firm that was more forward thinking than some firm that was still using AutoCAD. So we did some discovery. We actually did some fairly extensive discovery on site. We looked at all their hardware and network infrastructure, and turned out that was perfectly fine and suited. They didn't need to make any changes. We had interviews with all of their architectural staff, everybody, not just the principal of that group, but everybody. Like I said, there's about 6 of them, including the project managers. And we also interviewed their CAD manager, who was in charge of everything, civil engineering, building engineering, and architecture. So again, no immediate changes to the hardware network. That's a good thing. Very low level of BIM awareness. So they really were kind of living in the dark as far as BIM was concerned, and a high level of concern about downtime during the implementation and their ability to master new technology. Some of these guys were a little older and were afraid that that maybe they wouldn't be able to pick it up. I disagree with that sentiment myself, but that's very common. Also, we discovered that they were doing renderings, but they were being outsourced overseas, so they were paying a significant amount of money for these outsourced renderings. So short-term goals, better coordinated construction documents, very common. Fewer change orders and RFIs, again, very common. Ability to attract more creative talent. And then ability to partner with other BIM capable firms, because again, they'd been shut out of some of these other firms because they couldn't collaborate with them. They just had 2D work. Long-term benefits that they wanted to look at were energy sustainability, life cycle cost analysis, maybe some facilities management, computer-aided management system data put into the building model, lighting analysis, and then better coordinated multidisciplinary models. So the approach we took, again, very similar, except on a larger scale. We did some template and supporting content development, again, based on the current CAD standards. We did Revit fundamentals training, was conducted on site. Even though at this time we were doing most of our work remotely, these people wanted us on site, and we were happy to oblige. And frankly, I think that works out better if you can. We did a pilot project with some mentoring, and then we did some intermediate training, which we conducted remotely. That went well. And then we also did some advanced BIM manager training that we did remotely. We still work with this firm. We still do some training off and on with them. But we did this initial training as well. So the results, the architectural staff is now very proficient in Revit. They don't do anything in AutoCAD anymore. Training removed that intimidation, and even the old guys figured it out, right? All of their projects are being done in Revit. They actually, shortly after the implementation, they were able to hire a Revit knowledgeable project architect who was able to start to function sort of as a quasi pseudo BIM manager as well. Renderings are now being done in-house, and they're actually looking at doing some virtual reality stuff as well. Since then, they've had other departments in their organization also implement Revit. The electrical engineers and the wastewater treatment engineers are all now on Revit. And with that, I'll pause and or stop and take any questions that anybody has. And I want to thank you for attending the session. Hope it was meaningful for you. But again, we'll open it up for questions at this point. Okay, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Gonzalo Rosado, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. How can the transition from traditional design deliverables to BIM integrated ones be streamlined to reduce time consumption for designers and all stakeholders involved? Are there any effective methods or resources available to facilitate this? I'm assuming you meant to say transformation or transition. You know, there's not a real good answer for this, although I will say that if you're partnering with a third party, a lot of the work, a lot of the heavy lifting, so to speak, can be done kind of in the background where it doesn't really involve a whole lot of your people's time, you know, the template development, et cetera. Most of that's being done by someone else. And the designers really are not having to spend a whole lot of time on that. There may be some time spent reviewing and commenting on things as they develop. Most of the time commitment would really take place with training. So fundamentals training, maybe some advanced training, that kind of thing. And that can be spread out over time. You know, it's sometimes hard to get people all together in one place for an extended period of time due to billable work, that kind of thing. So sometimes we can make those sessions shorter, spread them out a little bit longer. Of course, that also extends the time frame of the implementation. But it's about the only way to do it. The second question, again from Gonzalo, is in an implementation, how can companies effectively address the long-standing issue of lacking standards and cultivate a unified culture to ensure successful integration, given that the necessity for shared language and sources precedes BIM adoption? So I think the gist of this is maybe a company doesn't have well-developed standards to begin with. Maybe there's some cultural issues that could get in the way. You know, that kind of goes back to some of the things that I was talking about how to make an implementation successful, and that is, you know, fostering excitement, rewarding people, upper management. Again, this is where upper management is really important. It has to have upper management mandate, buy-in, et cetera. They've got to be driving this because there are going to be people that maybe are not so willing to change. And if there's no existing standards or very poor standards or sometimes very disorganized standards, maybe that comes into play before any kind of template work, is actually some ongoing development of standards and consolidation. And again, that will require a little bit more input from the design team, but also the third party that might be helping you with this should be doing most of the heavy lifting on that. So hopefully that answered your question sufficiently. I don't see any more. If there are any more questions, pleasure, Gonzalo. there are any more questions, please put them in the chat. We're limited on time. I'm going to put my email address in the chat window here in case you come up with something later and would like to reach out to me. Feel free to send me an email, and I will be happy to answer any questions you have. A couple more questions here. So that's a good question, Pablo. The question is, do you need to create a template with the capacity to incorporate all dimensions of BIM, or can we modify a template as we go? You know, this kind of goes back to culture of continuous improvement, as well as focusing on what you want to get initially, right? Making sure that your goals are realistic and attainable. And so to answer your question, yeah, you'll start off with an initial template where a lot of, again, that heavy lifting has been done to get you to a certain level. But then after you finish a few projects, if you want to expand your implementation, that's probably going to require some further development of the template, maybe some changes to what's already there, adding additional content, new features come out in the product that you might want to take advantage of as well. And again, that may require some changes in the template. So the template is never finished. It's always a work in progress. It's a lot of heavy lifting up front, and then after that, it can be added to kind of piecemeal or, you know, as needs develop. And that's where that documentation comes into play, because in today's world, you know, people don't stick around at the same job forever, right? And so the person that maybe initially was very familiar with your template, they may be gone, right? And now you're wanting to make some changes to it, modify it, improve it a little bit. It's a good idea to know what's in there, and that's where that documentation comes into play. And I find Excel, it's a pretty handy tool for doing that. Any other questions? Okay, well, again, my email address is there in the chat, mdillon@asti.com. Feel free to drop me an email if questions come to mind later, and I will be happy to get back to you. Thank you for attending the session. I hope you found it valuable, and enjoy the rest of Innovate to Build. Bye.